Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham. I'm the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and it's really a very special privilege to be hosting Marty Baron this afternoon, who's here to talk about his riveting, revealing, and insightful new book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Early in the book, Marty notes with subtle bemusement, at least I interpreted it as subtle bemusement, that whenever he took over as a top editor somewhere, big stories seemed suddenly to erupt. Happened at the Miami Herald back in 2000, then again at the Boston Globe 4 months after he assumed the top job there. And in 2013, within several months of becoming executive editor at the Washington Post, wouldn't you know, the paper came into receipt of some of the nation's most closely held intelligence secrets in the form of documents leaked by Edward Snowden, revealing numerous NSA global surveillance programs. So yes, Marty's illustrious career in journalism, which also encompassed stints at the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times, has been marked by arguably more than his fair share of great stories dropping into his lap. But what his book about his 8 years of running the Washington Post newsroom shows, among other things, is that a lot more than simply good fortune explains why he's ended up so widely respected. He's brought a lot of impressive attributes to the news business, not just smarts and a well-honed news sense, but integrity, principles, mental toughness, and an unwavering focus on the essential mission of what news organizations do. And these have enabled him to identify what to pursue, inspire reporters to do the pursuing, and help shape meaningful story after story. Those attributes all were tested to an extent they never were before for him when he found himself in the rather remarkable position of navigating between Jeff Bezos as the owner of the Post and Donald Trump as President of the United States, all during a time, too, of changing social dynamics around race, gender, and the use of social media affecting coverage outside the newsroom and relations inside. But the story that Marty tells is not just about how he managed these things. It also reveals and reflects on how a major newsroom works, how it decides what to cover, how its reporters and editors interact and not infrequently disagree, and how the public and our republic are served in the end. And if you're wondering, as I did, whether Marty, who after all was an editor much longer than he was a reporter, can actually write, the book is proof that he indeed can. It is, in addition to everything else, a very engaging read. Now, joining Marty on the hot seat this afternoon will be someone who knows him and the Post and journalism very well, Karen Tumulty, a deputy opinion editor and columnist at the Post. In her long career, Karen also has served as a national political correspondent at the Post and has reported for Time magazine and the Los Angeles Times. And 2 years ago, Karen's own excellent book was published, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, which is a comprehensive and nuanced biography of the former First Lady. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Marty Baron and Karen Tumulty.
Thank you so much, Brad, and it is truly, truly a privilege for me to be here interviewing my very old friend back to our days at the LA Times more than 40 years ago, Marty Barron, just celebrating his latest achievement. And this is such a remarkable book. And throughout his career, Marty has really been a champion of the traditional standards of journalism. And if you have any doubt that he has stood up for traditional standards against the forces that would undercut them, I would just point you to the cover where you will find an Oxford comma.
That's the fault of my editor, who was back there, who said that we should use that they use that at Flatiron Books. So I said, okay, whatever you want. It's fine. I didn't feel strongly about the matter.
Well, we are going to talk about all that, and we're also going to have some time for questions at the end, and there's a microphone right there for them. But Marty, let's start where the book starts, which is at this remarkable dinner that you and Jeff Bezos and our then publisher Fred Ryan and my former boss, the late Fred Hyatt, had at the White House with Donald Trump. Now, this is June 2017. We're talking 5 months into his presidency. There were still people who would say, well, he'll grow into the office. So could you talk about that dinner and what impressions of Trump you took away from that dinner going forward?
Well, I would guess my first impression is that he was not growing into the office. Look, I thought my concern about that dinner, and I was concerned about that dinner, is that Trump would interpret Bezos' presence as meaning that he could influence the coverage of the Post, and that he was actually involved in the coverage of the Post, and that he was, as Trump had accused us of, that he was responsible for our critical coverage of Trump, and therefore could change the direction of the coverage to be more favorable toward him. So, my interpretation of what Trump was saying there was that he felt it could happen, and that Bezos was the person he really needed to talk to, and that is the person he was talking to was directly across from him at the dinner table. I was on the side, and he just, every time and then he'd constantly criticize the Post, speaking to Bezos, and then elbowing me with his left elbow, which, happened to me in grade school a lot, but it hadn't happened that often since then. But I also got the impression that he, first of all, that his animosity toward the press was real, but also useful to him. That he was going to keep it up. He described this as the worst of all the press, and I imagine that there was a lot of competition for the worst in his mind. The New York Times was up there as well, but at the time we were like number one on his list by what he was saying there, and that he was going to keep up these attacks. And also at one point, he pulled out he just pulled out of his pocket 47%, and he said this is where he stood in the Rasmussen poll, which tends to lean Republican, and he said, I can win with this. And the clear message was that he wasn't going to be a president for all of the people of the United States. He was going to be a president for the people who voted for him, because that was roughly what his percentage was in winning the presidency. And he was going to run a presidency to appeal to his base, and all he needed to do was to appeal to them, and he didn't really need to do, and he didn't expect to actually win the support of anybody else. And so he was going to run a presidency that would do everything for that base.
So, and then after that dinner, he would, from time to time, call you up and complain about, and at one point saying that the Post was making him look childish.
Yeah. Yeah, he in between he called Bezos, and we could talk about that if you want, he called, he had never called me up till that point. But all of a sudden after that meeting, I guess he decided this was an opportunity to just lean on me in a different way. And he called, and the first time was to complain about a story by, I think, as I recall, Phil Rucker and Ashley Parker. It was describing his behavior in the White House in a meeting, and he said that it had made him look like a child. And then he said, much to my astonishment, because I never thought I would hear these words from a president of the United States, he said, "I am not a child." So And I was thinking to myself, first of all, I can't believe I'm hearing this from the President of the United States. And secondly, that sounds actually very childlike to say that. So,
Well, so here we are. We're in the third presidential race in a row where Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. So what did you learn running the coverage in 2016 and 2020 that it sort of shapes what you see going on now, what the media should be covering more of, what it should be covering less of? I mean, there are people who will say, don't give him any oxygen, don't cover everything he does. But then what should the media have learned from the previous two elections?
well, I think there are a couple of things. And he is a really tough person to cover because he breaks all norms. But I think the most important thing for us to cover now is to really take a hard look at what he intends to do if he gets into the White House again. We need to know who he's going to be appointing as his members of his cabinet. What kind of people will they be? What he plans to do with the agencies that they would run and with the regulatory agencies. This most likely will be a vengeance tour, no question about it. And the targets of his vengeance will, of course, be the Department of Justice, the FBI, the press, the courts, you name it, and all of his political enemies. And they are already making plans, obviously, to do things. And I think we need to do a lot of reporting about what a second Trump presidency would look like, what it would mean for the country, and what it would mean for our democracy. And I think that would be much preferable to having yet another interview with Trump to talk about the 2020 race and have him make statements that are totally false, that he knows are false, that are actual lies, and repeat that over and over again, and then and then use the prosecutions against him to his own political advantage. It just gives him a forum. He tends to control conversations because of he's the interviewee, first of all, and then he's a domineering kind of personality. And I just don't know what useful purpose that serves at this point. The other thing that I would like us to do, and I know that there are people who criticize this kind of coverage, they say, oh, well, you're just going out in the country and interviewing people who are in diners and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's a caricature of what we ought to be doing. I mean, you've done this kind of reporting, and we need to know. I mean, I think one of the big problems for the press before Trump actually announced his presidency was that we hadn't taken the measure of the level of grievance in this country. We didn't anticipate that the country could possibly elect a person like Donald Trump. We couldn't imagine a candidate like Donald Trump even emerging. And people talked about Jeb Bush being the front runner. And of course, that campaign went nowhere. How could we think that Jeb Bush would be potentially the nominee when they were actually preferring somebody like Donald Trump? That's a misreading of the American public. And I think it's really important that we, the news organizations that have the resources to do this, should get out in the country and really take the measure of public sentiment and why people feel that way and really understand what it is that's driving them. And the truth is there are a lot of people in this country who are struggling with their lives. Their towns have lost companies, they've lost jobs, they're struggling to make what they used to make. Their kids don't have opportunities. They're concerned about all of that. And I think that we really need to show as news organizations, particularly the national news organizations, that we have a feel for what their concerns are, that we take that seriously, that we're not condescending to wide swaths of the American public.
And one more question before we move on from that dinner, because this has raised some eyebrows in our profession. That was an off-the-record dinner. It was not known to the Post staff, amazingly enough. Could you describe your thinking in deciding that what was a dinner that was where the rules were, it was off the record, which means, no taste, no sound, no smell, pretend it didn't happen, your decision to put it in the book?
Sure. Yeah. Well, everything he said at that dinner, he's said publicly since. So I don't think that his comments that were made at the dinner are would still be considered off the record, given that he's made those comments repeatedly in so many different forums since then. So he said them publicly, sometimes for books. He said them publicly in his rallies, all of that. So his actual quotes, they've appeared everywhere, and I don't think that that there's anything confidential about them at all. Then the question is, well, even disclosing this dinner in the first place. Primarily it was the Post that wanted this to be confidential because Bezos was going to be there. So, and I, ceded to that. I accepted that simply because my publisher wanted it to be confidential. And I understood why, because we didn't want everybody to know that Bezos was meeting with the president with the news department in tow. And, but the reality is that, the Post had editorialized against secret meetings in the White House. And it actually run an editorial before we actually had before we had that meeting in the White House, saying that the visitor logs for the White House, which had been public in the Obama administration, were no longer being made public by the Trump White House, and that was wrong, and the public was entitled to know. All right. So here we were, party to. I think what we were doing was completely hypocritical. And I didn't think it was appropriate to continue to be a party to that, what I viewed as hypocrisy.
Well, I want to talk about objectivity because, your mantra was, "We're not at war, we are at work." And, a lot of the book talks about both the external pressures on old standards of objectivity and the internal pressures. And it's a traditional standard and principle of journalism, but one of your predecessors as executive editor wrote in an op-ed in the Washington Post. Len Downey wrote that objectivity, that newsrooms would benefit by dropping objectivity. It's an unachievable standard. It's not only impossible to achieve, but undesirable. And Len Downey called objectivity a distortion of reality. Could you talk about that? What is objectivity achievable and desirable in this era that we're living in of deep polarization, of misinformation? One of our former colleagues, Jim Risen, has written that journalists, it's their job to become crusaders.
Yeah. Well, I think people misunderstand the meaning of objectivity. And the term really goes back more than 100 years. It was sort of popularized by, if that's the right word for this, by Walter Lippmann when he wrote Liberty in the News, a very small book, but where he talks about objectivity, and it's something that he later elaborated on. And the idea was not neutrality. It's not like false balance. It's not false equivalence. And I think people have conflated these ideas to say that, well, objectivity means false equivalence, means neutrality regardless of what the evidence shows. That is not the idea that Walter Lippmann had, and it's not the true meaning of the word objectivity. And so I believe in the true meaning, which is that when you embark on reporting, you have to recognize that you have all sorts of preconceptions, and that to a large degree, you have to say, okay, look, I know I have my preconceptions, but I need to go into the reporting with an open mind. I need to listen to everybody. I need to hear what they have to say. I need to look at all of the evidence, whatever evidence there might be, documents or, conducting interviews and whatever it might be, court testimony, the whole range of documentation that is available today. And then be rigorous, be thorough, be comprehensive, be open-minded, and be fair, but take all of that into account and then report what you've actually found to be true, what you know to be true, with always the recognition that there's a lot we don't know as well. And so that's what I mean by objectivity, and that is, I believe, the route to finding the truth. I think that a problem is if we are subject to our, these preconceptions that we have, then I think it sends us on the wrong path. I mean, it doesn't allow us to listen to people. It doesn't allow us to look fairly and open-mindedly at the overall evidence there. And, I give one of the points that I make in explaining this is to explain why I don't think it's balanced, is when I was in Boston, when I got to Boston and there was a priest who had been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids. And that was a column that I read the day before I started work. And at the end of that column, which was written by a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, Eileen McNamara, great columnist, and she said that so what you had the plaintiffs for the victims, survivors, saying that the cardinal himself knew of this abuse and then reassigned this priest from parish to parish without telling anybody. And the Catholic Church said, the Archdiocese said, that's not true, didn't happen. And that's exactly where the Boston Globe left the story. That's called balance, okay? One side said one thing, one side said something else. And when I went to my first meeting on my first day, I said, well, nobody had mentioned that they were pursuing the story. And then I said, well, what about this story? Can't we get at the truth of the matter? Why do we have to settle for one side saying one thing and one side saying something else? How do we get at the truth? And that's what we endeavored to do on two tracks. One was going to court to get internal church documents, and the second was doing a real journalistic investigation. And so the problem there was balance. That wasn't the solution, that was the problem. But the solution was objective reporting, which is saying, no, we're going to look at the totality of the evidence. We're going to get the court documents. We're going to talk to all of the people who've been affected by this. We're going to talk to the lawyers. We're going to talk to whoever we can, talk to the priests themselves who had been accused. And then we're going to tell the public what we found. And of course, what we found was a huge scandal, a total cover-up that had gone on for almost half a century in the Archdiocese of Boston and was really emblematic of the church throughout the United States and, as a matter of fact, throughout the world.
And later became the subject of the Academy Award-winning movie Spotlight, which, as I recall, you were in the audience that night, although I believe I remember you complaining that your seat was like in the second to the back row.
Yes, I was. It was way up. In the theater in Boston, in LA, it's like incredibly steep. And we were, I got there and I said, well, okay, at least we're not in the back row. And then I looked at the back row and they had more leg room than we did. So we were really in the worst seats in the house. So.
Well, early on, there was, as people were trying to figure out how to cover Donald Trump, there was a lot of attention paid to a single word, and that word was lie. You, early on, all but banned that word in the newsroom. You seem to have gotten over it, though, however, because I noticed that on page 283, you used the word lie 5 times in a single paragraph, and 2 paragraphs down from that, you refer to Trump as the liar in chief. So talk about that.
I guess I'm cured. I've been cured. Look, I mean, I think it makes sense for major news organizations to be really careful with the language they use, to make sure that when they use a word, that it's really appropriate. And lie suggests something quite specific, which means that the person who said something knew that what he was saying was true. With Trump, at the beginning, when he would make false statements, we couldn't be sure, really, that he knew that what he was saying was false. And that's what I wanted to say. It was false. And so and a lot of times the question was, is he like deluded? I mean, does he really believe this stuff? And it's just not true. And that's different from a lie. It doesn't necessarily speak well of Trump, by the way. And also, there was, I mentioned this in my book, there was a book by, a well-known philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, that was called, I'm not going to use the full word here, On BS, okay? And it was a very popular book at the time. And it talks about, somebody who doesn't even care whether anything is true or false. He just makes it up as he goes along. And Harry Frankfurt said that's even worse than a lie, because he doesn't even have any respect for the idea that something might be true to even lie. He just makes it up. And Trump does a lot of that, too. So we were waiting for a moment to say, okay, where do we actually show that he knew that what he was saying was false? And that moment came when he actually changed a statement regarding his son meeting with Russians who had offered evidence against Hillary Clinton, and that and they said, they welcomed them. And he sort of changed that. He denied it, and he actually clearly lied. And so we said that for the first time. And then over time, it became so clear that he knew that what he was saying was false, and we used it when we could demonstrate that.
Well, there was also a single sentence in the book that really jumped out at me, because so many of us who are out there trying to do our jobs wonder whether our work is even reaching the people who most need to hear it in this country that is so polarized, and people are so siloed in what their news consumption is. And you write that even before the 2016 election, there was a study by the Reuters Institute finding that the Washington Post readership, not the content, but the readership, leaned as far to the left as Fox News does to the right. And so is this a healthy situation? Is this inevitable in the kind of country we're living in? Or is there something that news organizations like ours should be doing to reach a broader swath of the population?
Yeah, well, that Reuters study is accurate. I mean, the fact is that consumption of news media in this country is incredibly polarized. And the same is true, by the way, of the New York Times, even more so, actually. I think their percent of is 95% or 96%. I can't recall the number.
You said the middle ground was Yahoo News, ABC News, and CBS.
Right. So we're a highly polarized news consumption market in this country, and we do have to work at it, reaching other people. And I think that I do think that there is a segment of the American public that is open to evidence, and beyond those who actually, who lean right, but who are open to evidence for sure. And so I think the important part is let's try to reach them. Maybe it's another 5% of the electorate. Maybe it's another 10% of the electorate. But a swing of 5 or 10% can make a very big difference in terms of people accepting things as fact when they are fact, and when you can prove that they're fact. And one of the things that I think we absolutely have to do is show why something is a fact. We need to be much more transparent, not just about who we are and how we go about our work, but the evidence that is the basis for our declaring something to be fact. So, and we have the tools to do that these days. I mean, online, we can show a court document. We can show a video. We can show so much. Not everybody's going to accept that. Look, there are people who look at the videos of January 6th and say, this was just a normal tourist visit. Not any sort of tourist visit I've ever been on myself, but somehow people can look at that and they don't believe their own eyes, they don't believe their own ears. But there will be people who will believe that and we need to show it to them as much as we possibly can, be much more transparent. And as I said before, I do think it's important that we show that we are news organizations that actually understand the struggles of all people in this country, and so we need to get out into the community. We need to talk to people. They need to see themselves represented honestly and honorably and fairly, and so that if they see that, they will be more receptive to what it is we're writing in the first place.
And I'd also like to turn to your experience at the Post. You came to the Post at the end of 2012, or at least it was announced. Maybe you didn't set foot in the building until 2013. 8 months later, the Graham family, which has owned it for 5 generations, decides to sell it to Jeff Bezos. And you answer one of the questions that I am constantly asked, and I think everyone who works at the Post is constantly asked, which is, one of the richest people in the world owns your newspaper. He has all kinds of business interests that are constantly coming up in front of Congress. Does he ever put his finger on the scale?
Well, I was worried that he would when he came. As you mentioned, he has all these commercial interests, and in fact, he did real business with the federal government, with the intelligence agencies, in particular the CIA. Amazon has a huge cloud computing business. It's the largest out there, and they were doing business with the CIA. And we had just published all these, as was mentioned, these NSA documents, the most classified documents in the U.S. government. And I was wondering, well, how is Bezos going to react, and how is he going to deal with something like this when it could potentially, you could imagine it potentially jeopardizing contracts with the CIA. So I was very nervous about that. And but he never did. He never interfered in our news coverage. I mean, he was interested in the business aspects, you know, the marketing, the pricing, the technology that we were using. He was interested in, you know, sort of overall, like, you know, were we covering the right subjects? Would there be news? Would there be new initiatives that we should launch? Different ways of telling stories, an overnight crew, things like that. New approaches to storytelling, things like that. But in the actual content of the stories, he wasn't, you know, he didn't get involved in that at all. Never once, not even during, not in our coverage of Amazon's business practices, its labor practices, it's all of that, intrusions into people's privacy, you name it. I mean, the person on staff who would review Amazon products, I don't think he had a single one that he liked, not one. And he actually called Amazon creepy. I mean, it was like, and I never heard a word. I never heard a word. That was Jeff Fowler. I never heard a word from Bezos about Amazon being called creepy. And then, of course, Bezos had, you know, he got divorced. He had an affair. It was the National Enquirer was on chasing him around and taking photos and all this sort of stuff, and we covered that. He never intervened. He never said, you know, objected to how we covered any of that, and he never has. And so I'm grateful for that. I mean, I can tell you this, that if he had done that, you would have heard about it, because newsrooms are the leakiest places on earth. I mean, and if anybody had gotten wind that somehow Bezos was really involved in influencing our coverage, you can be sure that it would have been leaked to all sorts of other news outlets, and we would have been written about. And all these years, we're now at 10 years, by the way. It's the 10-year anniversary on October 1st was the 10-year anniversary of his purchase, and you haven't seen a single story like that, And so non-existent was the evidence that people started to write that we must have been self-censoring ourselves. Of course, that was ridiculous too. We weren't self-censoring ourselves, and I was pleased when Jack Schaefer of Politico wrote that he had been spending years trying to find any evidence whatsoever that we were soft on Amazon in any way, and he discovered that not only were we not soft, we were often harder on Amazon. Which is not all that surprising, because newsrooms like to show that they're not the lackey of the owner, and so they sometimes can, you know, they'll want to demonstrate that.
Well, I'd also like to remind people what kind of situation the Washington Post was in when Jeff Bezos bought the paper for $250 million. I had just joined the paper a couple of years before you did, and it was all about managing decline. It was, the staff had been slashed over and over again. All the domestic bureaus had been closed. Most of the foreign bureaus had been closed. Our operating principle was that we were going to be news for and about Washington, which really showed how much the sort of vision for what the Post could do shrank. One of the main things that Bezos brought were resources. As he said, I'm giving you a long runway, but he never suggested he was going to open a candy store. This was a business proposition to him. Could you talk a little about his strategic sense for the paper?
Yeah. So when he came, the most important thing that he did, and the most fundamental thing he did, and I should say that everybody writes about it as if he's just pouring money into the place, and well, no wonder they, you know, turned around and he's just throwing his money at it. That's not true at all. He doesn't. He said we needed to have financial discipline, all of that. But the most fundamental thing he did was in the realm of ideas. All right. So, and the most fundamental idea was a fundamental idea of all was that we needed a new strategy at the Post. The phrase that was in currency at the Post at the time was that we needed to be for and about Washington. So basically written for people in the Washington metro area, writing about what happens in Washington, which of course involves national politics, but everything else essentially local. And Bezos said, you know, that was probably a good model for the past. It was highly profitable at one time, but it's not a model for the present. And he couldn't even think of a good model for local news coverage actually at the time. And so And he said, look, we have the opportunity. The internet is giving you a gift. And we were like, gee, what's that? And he said, you have this incredible opportunity. You're in the nation's capital. That's a great place from which to launch a national and even global publication. You have the name, the Washington Post, which is a name that can be leveraged to a national and international level, unlike all the other places that I've worked, like Boston and LA and Miami, all great, but that's not a name that works at a national level. And you have a history and a heritage that, going back to Watergate, that people can identify. That it has an identity. The Post has an identity as being an investigative-oriented place, a place that shines a light in dark corners, that holds government and politicians to account. And so there are all these people all over the country who've never read a word of the Washington Post, but have an idea of the Washington Post. And then we had this incredible opportunity because we live in a digital era, and we could distribute the paper. We didn't have to deliver a physical newspaper all around the country. All we needed to do was get people to read us online and ideally to subscribe to us online. And so the incremental cost of obtaining a new reader or a new subscriber was essentially $0. And that was the gift of the internet that he was encouraging us to take the gift. He kept saying, take the gift. And so that's what we did. And then we put in place a variety of initiatives that we hope would attract a national audience. When we went out to see him for the first time for first big, long, substantive meetings at his house outside of Seattle, and he said, he asked us for a bunch of ideas, and we came with a bunch of what we thought were good ideas, and he said, well, what were your parameters for these ideas? And we said, we just thought they were good ideas. And he said, well, why not? He said, I think we should have some parameters, and let me suggest two. One is what will appeal to a national audience and what will appeal to a younger audience, because if we don't cultivate a younger audience, we won't have an audience in 20 years. And by the way, I'd never heard an owner or a publisher talk about 20 years in our business. I always heard them talking about generally next quarter and sometimes next year if we were lucky. So I was just astonished that anybody was talking about 20 years.
And while you are in the book are generally admiring of Bezos' strategic sense, one place where you are critical is because he's never been in a newsroom. And I think generally people who haven't lived in a newsroom don't really understand the value of good editors. And when you are talking about sort of shifting the resources, Bezos didn't seem to understand how important it was to beefing up the editing ranks as well, correct?
Yeah, it was a bit of a nightmare. And it lasted pretty much my entire time at the Post, that nightmare. So he had this idea that there were direct employees who were direct and indirect, people who had direct contact with the consumer, meaning the reader in our case, and indirect, which would be like, management types, administrative types, what have you. So his view was that reporters would be, for example, direct, and editors would be indirect. Maybe social media people were on the staff were direct, and but a social media editor would be indirect. So there were a lot of problems with that, and because editors actually do play a very direct role in the coverage that we have and in the quality of the coverage that we have. And also there are a lot of people with titles of editor who are they're producing direct material for our readers. And so it was exasperating because I was asked to take every single person on the staff and identify whether they were direct or indirect. My first round is I just basically, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but I basically just made myself indirect and everybody else was direct. And that wasn't acceptable to the business side. And then we had to go back at it again. And, I ended up with about, I think it was 15% that was indirect. But I think the assessment by Bezos' the team that handles his personal investments, which the Post is, the basic view was, okay, well, fine, but it's going to be hard for him to get additional editors. And it was really hard to get additional editors. So it was a real struggle. I mean, to do that. I mean, we actually ultimately, a bit later, we had one of our terrific editors who was working all the time. And I noticed you said live in a newsroom, and I think sometimes that is what people do, is actually just live there. And so he was practically living in the newsroom, and he left to take another job. And he went to a place that wasn't really known for great family-friendly environment. It's called, the company that he said was preferable was Amazon. Amazon was preferable to the Washington Post in terms of its family-friendly environment. And we lost some really good editors. One of them is a national editor of the New York Times right now.
Well, I had promised that there would be time for questions. And so if people would like to come to the microphone, and I'm just going to ask you one more question before we turn to the audience, and that is, what do you think the future looks like? What is the future of objective journalism? 10 years from now, will there still be even a print product in existence? What's going to happen?
Well, there'll be some print products. I hope there will be books, for example. So there should be. And I think they will do well. But I think in terms of media, it's going to be rare, certainly in 10 years. I mean, people have been predicting the disappearance of print in media for a very long time. But it takes longer. People have habits. There are a lot of people who prefer print, but they tend to be older. And so print has been declining sharply over a long period of time. And so I think it's going to come a period of time where it's totally inefficient to produce print, because there won't be enough people on a block to actually distribute it. In terms of objectivity, I mean, I think that's up in the air as to see how it goes. I mean, clearly, a lot of people prefer to just turn to media outlets that reinforce their existing point of view, and we see that in a lot of different ways. I believe, maybe it's just an article of faith, but I actually believe that there's a substantial portion of the population that just wants us to be honest, open-minded, tell the people what we've actually found, tell it to them in an unflinching way, present them with the evidence, show it to them, and I believe that is a substantial portion of the audience, and I think that's what a place like the Washington Post should be.
Well, I certainly hope so. And yes, sir.
Do you think when people like Bezos buy the Washington Post and Musk buys Twitter, do you think these are done primarily for business purposes to make money for themselves, or is it enough just to be able to influence the public agenda?
Well, I wouldn't equate those two, by the way. I don't know exactly what Musk's purpose was. Twitter is no doubt worth a lot less today than it was the day that he acquired it. And he clearly is using it in many ways to advance a personal agenda. I mean, I get his posts at the top of my feed, and I don't follow Elon Musk, but there he is, no matter what. And so I have to read what he has to say. So he's clearly using it for a personal agenda. I'm not sure he really anticipated getting rich off that. He was already pretty rich. So richest person in the world, as a matter of fact. So Bezos, I don't think he imagined that he's going to, look, I mean, his wealth comes from Amazon. I mean, he's worth $150 billion today, something like that. He just built a yacht for $500 million. I don't think he sees the Washington Post as a route to wealth.
I like that his yacht has a support yacht.
Right. So, I mean, there's a whole line about, like, what do you call a billionaire who bought a newspaper? A millionaire. It's always been thus. So, and it's like, no, so I don't think he bought it for that. I do think that he felt that he could make it, that there was a chance that he could make it successful. And I would say the Washington Post today is worth a lot more than it was, than the $250 million that he spent to buy it. It has a much larger audience, a much larger national and global presence. It has financial struggles at the moment, but I think it's worth a lot more. But I don't think he intends to sell it. I don't think he has any desire to sell it. And I don't see him using it to advance an agenda. So I think there's another option among the two that you presented, and that is that he actually, I believe this because this is all I've seen, is that I actually think he believes that in democracy, that he believes in the role of the press, even though rightfully he's the target of it. It doesn't bother him, really. It doesn't seem to bother him terribly much. I don't think he actually cares what people think of him. So at this point, and I've heard him say, I have my friends, I have my family. It's good enough. And so I think he sees it as a really important institution and one that he thought he might be able to help, and that he believes in this democracy. And I would say there's a little bit of I think he likes business challenges. I think business is kind of his favorite sport. I know that there was a chance that he was going to buy this football team in this town, but I don't think that's really where his passion is. His biggest passion is space, but I do think he believes in democracy and that the Post played an important role, and he thought he could do something to help turn it around.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. First, I'd like to say thank you to Marty for helping to make the Post the great newspaper that it is. I love reading it. My question is about AI, and it's been in the news a lot lately. And I am curious about what you think it's going to do to the news for two things. One is the content of the news, and the second is about deep fakes, which I'm very worried about in the political environment.
Yeah, well, you should be. This is generative AI, and it poses huge risks, certainly for society as a whole. They'll be able to mimic people's voices, so all that voice security features that you have, they'll be useless, I think. There will be a lot of images that will be faked, videos that will be faked, all of that. And that's really concerning. And for news organizations, they're really going to have to be on alert for that and create systems to detect that so they don't find themselves disseminating really bad information. Internally within news organizations, there's some that have experimented with generative AI writing stories. I think that's really a bad idea. These things produce all sorts of what they call hallucinations. I call it fabrications. So, which is I think the right word for it, just things that aren't true. I asked ChatGPT to write an essay on me, and it had 10 errors in there. I said one of my former bosses had won the Pulitzer Prize, so I sent him a congratulatory note. I said I regretted being so late at sending it to him. I do think it has a use within newsrooms to help with time management issues here. A lot of people in news organizations have to do a lot of things they never had to do. They had to put metadata on their stories. They have to write alerts. They have to select photos. They have to write evolving developments in the story. And if you use the content that's actually within the news organization, its own archives, its own content, and it's subject to review by the reporters and the editors themselves, I think it can be actually quite helpful and help journalists manage their time. So I'm actually helping to advise some company on that, and that is what we're going to hope to do. So I'm just like incidental to the company, but that's the idea.
But what about as a competitive threat? When AI can essentially aggregate everything that is out there, it seems like news organizations could get crushed.
Yeah, it's possible. I'll have to wait and see. Somebody did send me a story about I live in Western Massachusetts, and somebody sent me a thing about how a town in Western Massachusetts was rated one of the most beautiful places to visit, and I wanted to see who wrote this, and at the bottom it says it was written by ChatGPT. And so I sent it to this guy, and I'm like, hey, this came from ChatGPT. What does this mean? And he kind of shrugged his shoulders. But I think that there is that risk. I would have to wait and see whether it amounts to a huge threat. I don't know.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Marty, great book. I really appreciated and how you doing, Karen? Really appreciated how you went through a lot of the Me Too reporting that the Post has done. I wondered, given the social pressure in one direction, do you think that the Post that you left can do the type of reporting that you saw from Emily Yaffe and Reason with regard to John Kamen and Jane Mayer, which she did with Al Franken? Do you think it can be reported that way from the Post given so much of the social dynamics and the political dynamics that have that reporting going in the other direction? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I have a whole chapter on the Me Too stories. They're the single toughest stories that I've ever dealt with. They're really hard because you want to do justice for real victims of abuse and assault, but you also want to be fair to people who've been accused. And there are huge risks for news organizations as well, because there's a risk if you don't highlight real abuse, because other people will be abused. There's a risk if you actually end up falsely accusing somebody, because that person's life can be completely destroyed. Their whole career can be destroyed. And by the way, they might actually file a libel suit against you, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. And so it's really hard. So you have to have a set of standards to say, okay, what's the threshold that we require in order to publish? Have we demonstrated that we've done a diligent job here as much as we can? One of the standards that I talk about in the book that was really important for us in deciding whether to publish or not is that at least one victim, typically a woman, had to be identified, had to come forward and identify herself. And I know that there are huge risks in doing so. I understand why women would not want to do that, but that we required at least that. And the same is with the New York Times, by the way. Those original Me Too stories, if you've read the book She Said, and if you've watched the movie She Said, the thing that they were emphasizing that we need somebody to go on the record. We need, and they wanted more than one, certainly, to go on the record. And there are some ways that you can circumvent that if you find, for example, documents, a court document or something like that, or you find a non-disclosure agreement that actually identifies who committed the abuse and what the abuse or assault was, that sort of thing. So there are other ways where somebody doesn't necessarily have to go on the record, but you need something more definitive, and it is really hard. And I've been criticized, as I point out in the book, from every side. I've been criticized for publishing stories, and I've been criticized for not publishing stories. And I expect that that'll be the case for anybody who's in charge of that kind of coverage at the Washington Post.
I want to congratulate you on the turnaround at the Washington Post. I wasn't aware that's how it happened, but I did notice that the Post was I've been here for 40 years. The Post was kind of declining, and then suddenly it seemed to be much better. And I follow you. I follow your columns, and I really like them.
That's why it turned around.
My question is, there was a former editor here from the New York Times last week. The news business in smaller communities, including places like Boston, which is where I'm from, is kind of collapsing. And in smaller communities all over the country, newspapers are going out of business, whether they're digital or they're, analog. Do you think that newspapers like the Times and the Post and the LA Times, I guess not the Wall Street Journal, have a responsibility for helping the industry out in the sticks, maybe by developing, news wire service type things, especially now that you don't have to go to those places to get information about them, or stringers out there, because communities are collapsing. That's really the most important thing. The newspapers were a way to help keep a community going, where otherwise it just becomes a whole bunch of retired people and little children.
So I think, I think it's an important point you make right there at the end, is that local news organizations are what have bound a lot of communities together, and without them, they start to fracture and in ways that we can't even imagine, because we haven't seen it. News communities without news organizations. I don't know. I don't believe that the Post or the New York Times can solve the problems of local news. A place like the Post has huge challenges just solving its own problems, by the way, and they're significant today as they were back when I arrived. I think the Post can turn around and will, as I thought it could do when I got there in 2013. But that's a huge challenge in itself, and I don't think that it can dedicate itself to trying to solve the problems of local news organizations all around the country. It does not have the resources for that. And that wire service, there have always been wire services. The problem is that what you really need in these local communities is covering what's happening in those local communities,
Right.
covering their school boards, covering their city councils, covering their police departments, covering the environmental agencies, covering all of those kinds of things that are important. So, I do think there are some signs of hope. So in Boston, the Globe is doing okay. It's not minting money, but I think it's doing okay, doing a lot of the right things, has stable ownership, wealthy ownership, and they're doing a lot of good journalism. Same is true in Minneapolis, San Francisco, Dallas, some nonprofits that are doing well. The Texas Tribune, it had some layoffs, but it's grown quite a bit. Cal Matters, which is a big nonprofit in California. There are many others. There's something called the National Trust for Local News, which actually ended up acquiring a bunch of commercial newspapers in Maine and is doing a really good job. And they're putting together a similar network in Georgia. I was just recently in Macon, Georgia, and they are starting up a news operation there. So I think that there's hope. All of those news organizations have to somehow, through their coverage, make clear to readers day in and day out that they're providing them material that's of real value to them in their daily lives and that it's worth paying for. If readers aren't going to pay for it, newspapers aren't going to survive. A lot of people ask, well, shouldn't everything be free? Of course, Bezos was really against that being free. He said, we just have to tell people that was just a mistake. I'm sorry, we're going to charge. We didn't give it away free in the past. It used to be you get a physical newspaper, you either had a subscription or there was a newspaper box, remember those? And you put a quarter in them and out popped it, you picked up a newspaper and you were trusted to take one. Although when I was working in Miami, I would see people, just look at the newspaper and read all the headlines. And I wanted to just go give them a quarter and just say, look, just put the quarter in the box. Or people would open the box and they'd take a few of them. But you still had to pay. So we weren't giving away our work for free then.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be quick then. First of all, I know my family will be pissed if I don't say this, but Northeastern Irish Catholic group, they don't like anybody. They think of you as a folk hero. So thank you so much for all the work that you do.
I'm the only guy, huh?
Yeah,
wow,
exactly.
That's amazing.
So in reading the Post, I know we've talked a lot about local journalism, but a lot of the investigations that you and others have done rely on this super specialized information, forensic accounting expertise, biomedical issues. I think, for example, now, I love the reporter Lena Sun and her reporting on the CDC, such deep beat knowledge. First to ask every single question on briefings. How would you recruit reporters like that who could then ideally instigate these kind of large scale investigations?
Yeah, well, I do think journalism has been becoming more specialized since I got into the field. Shortly after I became a reporter, I became a business reporter. A couple of years after I started reporting, and I had gotten an MBA, and so they figured hey, MBA, make him a business reporter. So, which I was actually interested in the subject, and it was incredibly important, and it became ever more important, particularly after 1979 when the deregulation of interest rates, we started having money market funds and things like that, and all of a sudden there was advertising, and people were really interested in business. And so I had detected that actually because, I don't know, I was one of these weird kids who kind of knew what he wanted to do, in junior high school. And so I was following the newspaper business, and I saw that it was becoming more specialized. And then being a careerist, I was like, oh, that's a good specialty for me. So in any event, it's become ever more specialized, as you indicate. Science reporting is incredibly important. Technology coverage is incredibly important. I think that people in the universities who are studying to be journalists should be double majoring at the very least to learn computer science, learn medicine, learn technology, whatever it might be, and business, because we really need that level of expertise in a society that's incredibly complex. But we need something beyond just an understanding of the complexities. We need the ability to translate that to ordinary people. That's what news organizations do, is they should be able to take these complex subjects and explain them to ordinary people. Lena does that really well for the Post. Many other people do as well. And that's our mission, and explain, and so you need multiple skills. You need the skill to understand the subject matter and the ability to communicate that subject matter to a general audience.
Thank you.
Well, our time is up, but I want to thank all of you for coming out and congratulate you, Marty.
Thank
on
you.
the
Thanks
terrific
for
book.
coming, everybody.